And you're all ready for our afternoon keynote. I'm so excited. So, you know, I told you the story in May, for those of you that were here, that I read this amazing book by Bruce Katz. I sent him a cold email, and lo and behold, he showed up, and he was our keynote for May. Well, I did the exact same thing with Dr. S. I read the book, God's Hotel, and I was blown away. I learned so much about our healthcare system, about policies that were put into place decades ago that we're living with today, about stories of her patients at Laguna Honda Hospital that were just heart-wrenching. I just thought it was, I learned so much. So I thought, what the heck, why not? I sent her an email, and she responded, and she's here today. So I'm really excited. She's going to talk and share some of the stories from her book, God's Hotel. And then she's also going to talk and refer to her new book, which I actually haven't even read yet, which is called Slow Medicine, which is a follow-up to her first book. So without further ado, please give a nice warm welcome to Dr. Victoria Sweet.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yes, the green button. Yeah, she sent me an email, and when she told me about what she was doing, I was really impressed. I had a chance to spend quite a bit of time in Santa Cruz over the years, and I know some of the issues of Santa Cruz, and to see this many people for the whole Monterey Bay area get together in such a really impressive setting, really. I mean, when I look out at you, it's really wonderful, and I think it's the way to go about getting some changes, which is regional, right? Not federal, not the whole government, but right here where we know the issues. So what I am going to talk about today is I want to give you a sense of what I mean by slow medicine, and I want to see if I can convince you that we can save money by spending time. That's kind of the essence of the matter. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself and how I came to this conclusion, by telling you a little bit about myself, a little about the unusual hospital where I practiced medicine for 20 years, and then kind of where I see where we've been, where we are now, and where we are headed, and where we could be headed. So I'll talk for about 42 minutes or so. So we should have some time for questions, answers, and comments, which I always really like because I learn a lot from the audience. At one of the talks, I was really struck by somebody told me that the slogan for the Navy SEALs is slow is smooth, and smooth is fast. So that kind of stuck in my mind. I like that way of looking at it. So the first thing really you should know about me is that the slide doesn't move. Okay. Let me go. Okay, we'll start there. Is that I don't consider myself a natural-born doctor. So by that I mean growing up, I wasn't interested in, I didn't volunteer in hospitals. I didn't look at doctor shows on television. If somebody was sick or had an owie, I didn't want to know anything about it. And nobody in my family had ever gone to had been a doc. And in fact, when I told my family that I was going to medical school, they were absolutely shocked. What had happened was at the end of college, when I was thinking about what I was going to do next, I discovered the writings of Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, in a bookstore by accident. Particularly, I discovered his memoir, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I was completely taken by it. I was taken by the meaning he expected from his life and other people's life. And I was particularly taken by the life he'd set up for himself, living in this stone house on the Lake of Zurich, seeing neurotic, articulate, well-paying patients in the morning, and illuminating manuscripts and studying astrology in the afternoon. I thought this would be a great life to have, so I decided I was going to be a Jungian analyst. But then it turned out you had to go to medical school at that time to get into the Jungian school, so I started medical school. And then it turned out I liked medical school a lot more than I thought I would. I'm just curious, how many, are there docs here? Could you raise your hand? I just want to see how much, and nurses? Okay, so it was the last 2 years of medical school. So medical school is 4 years, of course, after college. And the first 2 years are kind of book learning. But the last 2 years, you actually go into the hospital. And I found I really liked being with patients. I really liked the whole process. We're taught in medical school in those last 2 years to do what's called the workup. The workup has 4 parts. There's the history. There's listening to what the patient says is wrong with them, listening to how they say it, listening to what they say and what they don't say. And I found there was so much psychology to it. I liked that. And then there was examining the patient, and I liked that too. Because if I had the time to do a really good exam, I could find out so much about what the patient had and didn't have. And then there was trying to figure out what labs and x-rays to get, and then putting it all together in the diagnosis and the treatment and the plan. I thought it was brilliant, a brilliant method. But I still continued my first plan to be a Jungian psychiatrist, so I started a psychiatry residency. But I wasn't very sophisticated. So the psychiatry residency I started turned out to be in the only locked ward in the county I was living in. And I found out pretty quickly that those patients were not Jung's neurotic, articulate patients. They were severely psychotic. And I found out that they responded much better to the antipsychotic medication I gave them than they did to any talk therapy I tried. So after I finished the first year, which is after you get your license, I thought, well, maybe I do like medicine. I think I'll go out and just practice medicine for a couple of years and see if I like it. So that's what I did, and I practiced in community clinics and county clinics, and they were fascinating places to practice. So eventually I bit the bullet and said, I'm just going to actually be a real doctor, become an internist, which takes another 3 years of a residency. And so that's what I did. I went back and I did my residency, and I became an internist, and I went back to practicing in community clinics. And the longer I practiced medicine, the more impressed I was by Western, modern medicine's rational method, logical method for arriving at a diagnosis and a treatment. But the longer I practiced, I was also impressed by what modern logical medicine left out. Anything that wasn't logical. So the doctor-patient relationship, or the placebo effect, or the way certain people would get better from fatal diseases for no apparent reason. I got really interested in this part, and I decided it was kind of a missing piece of Western medicine. So I started looking at alternative medicines, Chinese medicine, naturopathy, Ayurvedic medicine, which were beautiful systems. For a while, I even thought about learning Chinese so I could understand Chinese medicine from the inside. But eventually, I decided that even if I'd learned Chinese, that way of thinking was too foreign from my own to really grasp this other way of looking at the body. So it was at this kind of dismaying juncture in my life that I discovered another book in the library that, let's see now, that really changed my life. I was looking, and this book popped out at me. It was called Hildegard of Bingen's Medicine. And in that book, I learned that Hildegard of Bingen, and I know we have 2 slides and only one person, so I will alternate. But this is a painting of Hildegard from her own time. So Hildegard, I learned as I was standing there reading the book, who had been a 12th century nun. She was a mystic and a theologian, a philosopher, a composer, an artist, but she'd also been a medical practitioner in the 12th century. This is Heloise and Abelard, Becket, the Crusades, just to give you a place to put it. So a long time ago, more than 1,000 years ago, she'd been a medical practitioner, and she'd written a book about her medicine. And it had just been translated from Latin into German and German into English. And as I read this book, I was really taken aback, because it was not what I'd expected from a medieval medical book. It was not the eye of newt, toe of frog, sprinkling holy water kind of thing. It was clearly a real medicine from the 12th century for real patients with real diseases I could recognize. But it was based on a completely different model of the body from my own logical method. So at that moment, I decided I was going to go back and get a PhD in history of medicine with Hildegard of Bingen as my focus. Because I really wanted to understand this Western medicine that we'd completely forgotten that seemed to be a lot like Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, and naturopathy. And that's how I actually got to a very unusual hospital in San Francisco called Laguna Hospital. Because I didn't want to stop practicing medicine when I went back and got my PhD. And at the time, it took me a couple of months to find a place that would let me practice medicine part-time. So Laguna Hospital was the name of the place, and I drove over for my interview. And when I saw it high on the hill overlooking the ocean, I was completely taken aback because it looked like a 12th century medieval monastery. It had cream-colored walls and a red-tiled roof, a bell tower, and turrets. So I went for my interview, and then the medical director took me out for the tour. Now, mind you, this was right in the middle of San Francisco. It was on 62 acres of land. And as she took me out for the tour, she told me about the place. It had at that time 1,178 patients. So we walked around. It was just amazing. She showed me the old-fashioned open nightingale wards where the patients still were taken care of and lived. She took me upstairs and showed me our x-ray department where we could take our own x-rays and read them. She showed me the lab where I could make my own slides and look at a microscope. Then she took me, we walked past this old-fashioned 1950s era beauty salon with its steel helmet hair dryers so that patients could have their hair done. And then we went downstairs and she showed me that this place, which was run by the city and county of San Francisco, had its own chapel, which was actually much more like a church. It had real stained glass windows, polished wooden pews, and a very politically incorrect Stations of the Cross along its walls. And then we went outside, and she showed me these 60 acres, which were amazing. There was an aviary so that patients could see chickens hatch from eggs. There was a greenhouse so that patients could pot plants. And there was even a little barnyard so that patients could see animals, even if they were bedbound. Then we walked back to her office and she offered me the job. Well, I didn't know. I wasn't sure. I'd never seen a place like this. But on the other hand, it was the only place that would let me practice medicine part-time. So I told her I would come for 2 months. And I ended up staying for more than 20 years. Because it turned out to be a fascinating place to practice medicine. And there was a reason for that, and that was because Laguna Hospital had originally been called the San Francisco Almshouse. And the almshouse was actually how we used to take care of the sick poor before there was health insurance. So we actually had a way. This system we inherited from England, and it grew out of the Middle Ages, and it was a system where every county in the country was responsible for their own sick poor, which is why we're responsible for them today, as a matter of fact. And the system they'd set up was that every county almost had an acute general hospital for the acutely ill, and then every county also had an almshouse for everyone else. Everyone you didn't know what to do with, you could send to the almshouse. So chronically ill, people who needed more rehab, people just out of prisons, women who were unmarried and pregnant, orphans, lunatics, okay, and I use that word advisedly, they all had a place to go. If you didn't know what to do with them, you sent them to the almshouse. And typically, the almshouses were located when cities were founded at the edge of the city border. But as the cities grew around them across the country, that real estate became very valuable. And by the time I got to Laguna Honda, it was probably the last almshouse in the country. All the other ones had been closed down starting in the 50s by the left, who thought that that kind of care was not fair, and by the right, who knew it was expensive. So almost all the almshouses were closed except for Laguna Honda, and practicing at Laguna Honda was amazing. Because typically the almshouse would typically get the bottom 0.1% of people. Everybody had fallen through the cracks. And so it was a catchment area for the entire city. So if something happened in 1 in 100,000, I would see it. So I learned an amazing amount of medicine there. The patients were also amazing because being as how they were the 0.1%, they were 3 standard deviations I learned from the mean, from any mean. So they were literally the tallest and the shortest patients I ever had, the oldest and the youngest, the nicest and the meanest patients I ever had. And they had almost every disease too, right? Because if a disease happened in 1 in 100,000, I'd see 1 or 2. So it was fascinating, and I ended up staying for 20 years. The longer I was there, the more I was impressed with the kind of care that we were able to give, because we were over the hill to the poorhouse, and I had enough time to do a good job. We were not completely off the radar screen, but we were pretty much off the radar screen. So I would examine my patients on those old-fashioned long open Nightingale wards, and I'd have about 2 hours to examine these complicated patients. And I learned that you pretty much needed that amount of time. And if I did have that time, I found out that a lot of what the patient had written in their chart, their diagnoses, they didn't have. And a lot of the medications they were on, they didn't need. On the average, I found that the patients I would get to admit would be on between 15 and 26 medications, of which they only needed 5 or 6. But nobody else had the time to go like, I don't understand why you need prostate shrinking medicine when your prostate was taken out 5 years ago. That's a true story. I had patients who had the diagnosis of AIDS who were on AIDS medicine who didn't have AIDS. I had patients with diabetes on insulin who didn't have diabetes. Nobody else had had that time to take them off, and I was really fascinated by how apparently inefficient what I was doing seemed, but actually how efficient it was. And even more, I was impressed by what I learned at a big old-fashioned place like this about what it's like. I called it hospitality. What it's like in a city when it has a place to send patients, any patients, no question asked, for as long as they needed to stay. Community, right? Because the other side of Goffman's institutionalization, which everybody's been running from for the last 50 years, is community. There was a community there, not just of the docs or the nurses, but of the whole group. And then charity, what it was like to be able to give care to a patient. I mean, I was paid, but to be able to give care and I learned about the transactional nature of giving in terms of care. I was also impressed by how efficient it was in the terms of what I call that medicine is personal. Right? When I added up the hospitality, the community, and charity, I thought what the really essence of the matter is, medicine is personal. It's face-to-face and person-to-person, and that's when it works. And I ended up with a very odd definition of works, of my own, not that we had quality assurance measures done and the MIPS regulations fit, but that for me, medicine works when the patient is happy, the doctor is happy, we have the right diagnosis and the right treatment for the least amount of money. That's my definition. And then in a place like Laguna, Honda, we had something called the efficiency of inefficiency. It was actually efficient for us to be inefficient, and I give you many examples of that. So in the meantime, I'd gone back to school, and I was, with the other half of my life, I was studying Hildegard of Bingen and her remarkable life and her medicine. I wanted to understand it from the inside because my hypothesis was it's the missing piece of Western medicine, the piece that we know is missing. So I wanted to understand it from her perspective as if I were her student. So I decided the way to do that is I needed to read it in her language, which was Latin and German. So I took classes and I learned medieval Latin and German. And I took classes in paleography and codicology so I could actually read the texts. And I found a lot of other examples of Hildegard's medicine, because her medicine was actually the way people practiced medicine in the Middle Ages. And I also planted her herbs, because it was mostly herbal medicine, in my garden to see what that was like. And then I took her prescriptions that were in her book, and I brewed them up. I made her potions and her syrups. I brewed her medicinal beers, and I baked her antidepressant cookies. It took me about 10 years to understand what I wanted to understand, which was how Hildegard's model of the body differs from our modern mechanical model of the body. Because essentially, our model of the body is that the body's a machine or a collection of machines. As you can see in this really beautiful poster by this guy named Fritz Kahn from the 1920s. So we still today, we think of the body as, you know, the brain's a computer, the lungs are bellows, the heart's a pump, the liver and kidneys are filtering devices. And in our model, the doctor is a mechanic. Disease is what's broken, and our job as a doctor is to find what's broken and fix it, repair it, or replace it. Hildegard's model of the body, I learned gradually, was very different. Her model of the body was that the body was a plant, and the doctor more like a gardener than a mechanic. Well, what's the fundamental difference between a machine and a plant? There's a lot of differences, absolutely. But one of the main ones that struck me as a doc is that someone else has to fix a broken machine by definition. But a plant can heal itself. And Hildegard, I discovered, had a name for the power of a plant to heal itself. She called it its viriditas, its greening power. That's from the Latin viridis. The Spanish gets verde and French vert. So viriditas means greenness. Plants obviously had that. And Hildegard's, the real sort of hypothesis, you might say, very unique to her, was that human beings also had viriditas, and that the job of the doctor, like the job was to be a gardener and to remove what's in the way of his or her patient healing. But you know, I didn't really understand this till one particular patient. I did sort of gradually get this, but I had one patient in particular who kind of coalesced Hildegard's way of thinking for me, and I call her Terry Becker. And the reason there's a blank slide is I don't like to listen to stories when there's a slide on front. I think of it as a slow slide. So Terry was a patient I had many years ago now. She changed my life. She was 37 years old when I met her, and she was homeless, and she lived on the streets with her boyfriend, Mike. And they smoked, and they drank, and they took drugs. And then one day, Terry woke up, and she was paralyzed from the neck down. So since the city of San Francisco still had its old-fashioned system and its general hospital, Mike trundled her over to the general, and with the miracles of modern medicine, in only 3 days, they figured out that she had a viral transverse myelitis, which is an infection of, she had an infection of her spinal cord, which had blocked all of her nerves from moving. There's no treatment for it because it was a virus, but it generally gets better over time. So since San Francisco had its old-fashioned almshouse, they sent Terry over for rest and rehab, and I was her doctor. And examined her, and she did get better. She began to be able to move her shoulders, light her own cigarette, which was a relief. But then the first of the month rolled around, which was and is actually to this day when homeless people can turn up at City Hall and at that time get $360 in cash for showing up the first of the month. So her boyfriend Mike showed up, told me he was just going to take her out for a few hours to get her cash, and out he trundled her with her Foley in our wheelchair and told me he'd be back in a couple of hours. And I didn't see her again for a year. During that year, as it turned out, they'd lived on the street, she lived in her wheelchair, and she had been to the emergency room 28 times for various things. Mike, in the middle of winter, had beaten her up, broken her skull and her tibia, stolen her money, and abandoned her on the streets of San Francisco. And, worst of all, she had developed a huge bed sore from sitting in the wheelchair all day long. She'd been admitted to the county 3 times for another miracle of modern medicine, a grafting of the bedsore. But every time that graft was just about to heal, the first of the month would roll around, and Mike would show up, and Terry would go out with him, and the graft would deteriorate, and the bedsore got bigger. Finally, it was too big to graft, and the surgeons in the ER threw up their hands and said, "You're just going to have to go to Laguna, Honda, let them do what we call wet to dries, just local care 3 times a day and hope it heals on its own." And it just so happened serendipitously that when she was admitted, I was her doc again. And when I saw her after that year, I have to tell you, I was completely shocked. She looked like she was in her late 50s by then. She was drawn, she was exhausted, she was sick. When I rolled her over and looked at the bedsore, I was just horrified. It was the biggest thing I'd ever seen. It was about this big. It went from the middle of her, it was all from the middle of her back all the way down to her coccyx, and it went from sit bone to sit bone. And it was filled with all that decayed and decaying graft tissue that had been sitting there. And at the bottom, behind all that tissue, I saw a little bit of a bone. I saw Terry's spine. On the other side of which, of course, is all her internal organs, her intestines, etc. I looked at that thing and I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? That thing's going to take forever to heal. And in the meantime, what's going to stop her from getting an infection that's going to kill her? Because in that case, it doesn't work for me to give antibiotics prophylactically because the germs just become resistant to them. So I just left. I walked back to my little office. We had these little offices. And I sat there, and I found myself thinking, Terry Becker's going to die of a medieval disease in the 21st century. So then I thought, well, if it's a medieval disease, I wonder how Hildegard would think of this disease. And I found myself staring into a plant that a patient had potted for me in the greenhouse years before. By this time, it had grown all over the wall. And I asked myself, well, how would Hildegard have seen this thing? How would she have conceived of it? And I thought about the idea of viriditas and this idea that coursing Terry's body was this power of healing. And I thought, well, maybe Hildegard wouldn't do anything at all. Maybe she would just remove what's in the way. So then I thought, well, what's in the way? Well, all that dead tissue's in the way, and all of it has to be removed. What else? Well, any medications she didn't need. She was one of my 26 medication people. Had to be DC'd if she didn't need it, so that's what I did. And then I thought, anything that gets her attention, uncomfortable bed clothes or a bad mattress has to be changed. And then I thought, maybe then what Hildegard might do is just nourish viriditas with the basics, good food, fresh air, sunlight, rest. So that's what I did. I wrote my orders, and it was amazing how fast Hildegard's prescription began to work. By that first week when I looked at it, I started to see a kind of cleanness at the base of that wound, a kind of shining. But then Mike showed up. The first of the month rolled around, and Mike showed up. And he was still pretty cute. He was about 10 years younger than Terry. He was like in his 20s. And he was still pretty cute, he had a little blonde hair, and he wore little Levi's, And the nurses and we made him wait in. We had a waiting room, and of course this was an open ward. So we all watched Terry on her prone gurney so that she didn't put pressure on it, kind of wheel herself all the way down the ward and go in to meet with Mike. And we all stood there and waited. We waited a long time. Finally, the door opened, and Mike came out and left. Terry had thrown him out. She told him never to come back. And then she stopped smoking. And her appetite came back and started to eat. And that bed sore began to fill in. It was an amazing experience to watch it because I only saw it once a week. The nurses would take care of it. So once a week, once it was under, I would see it. And so watching it heal over time was kind of like watching those time-lapse photos, movies that they used to show us in school, where you'd watch the little plant, the seed, and then the little leaves pop out, and then the next thing goes. That's what it was like to watch Terry Becker's bed sore heal. First there was that shining, and then suddenly there was like muscle starting to be there, and then subcutaneous tissue, and then the skin seemed to be crawling in from the sides, so it was getting shallower and shallower and smaller, until finally it looked just like a big old scab on her back. And then the scab flaked off, and there was new, perfect Terry Becker skin underneath. It's amazing. It took a long time. It took 2.5 years. But we weren't in a hurry, and neither was she. And during those years, because we still had an intact institution, the social worker was able to locate her family, who lived in the Midwest, and wanted her to live with them. And we had a patient gift fund for such eventualities. We bought her a ticket and sent her to live with her family. And she did live with her family and didn't go back in the streets and lived for many years. So Terry changed the way I practiced medicine after that. It was a remarkable experience. And this was around the same time that slow food was coming in. And when I tried to conceive of what it was I'd seen with Terry, I thought, you know, it's kind of like slow medicine. It's sort of the way slow food is compared to fast food. It's like slow medicine. That's how I came up with the thought of slow medicine. And I will say, around the same time as I thought this, there's at least 5 other doctors in the world who came up with the same idea at the same time independently. So I think that's telling. And for me, what slow medicine is in part, it's a way of looking and asking myself, not just as if I'm the mechanic, which I think it's very useful. Fast medicine with its mechanical model is incredibly useful. I always use it with my patients. I first ask myself, what's wrong, what's broken, and how can I fix it? But after I've done that, I step back and I think about Hildegard and I think about slow medicine and I think about viriditas. And I ask myself, what's in the way of viriditas? What's in the way of this patient healing? You know, medications, bad family life, depression, whatever, and what can I do to remove it? And then what can I do to nourish viriditas? And what I found was both ways, fast medicine and slow medicine, the way of the mechanic and the way of the gardener, worked well when applied to the right patient at the right time. So Hildegard's way really works best with patients who have slow diseases, by and large, right? Chronic diseases, diseases that are slow in coming on, or diseases for which we have no treatment. But it also works well in addition to the fast medicine, right? Which works so well when you're in a car accident or, you know, have a heart attack or even have cancer, but which doesn't work so well after the angioplasty, after the hip replacement, repair, and even after the chemotherapy. So what I find is putting these two perspectives together gives me just the way our two eyes with its two perspectives gives you a three-dimensional view. Putting fast medicine and slow medicine perspectives together when I'm with a patient gives me kind of a three-dimensional view. Now by this time, see, we're good. By this time, I'm actually going to go back here for a second. Laguna had been discovered. The Department of Justice showed up one day and was to investigate the place and was horrified by everything it saw. The open wards, the aviary, the zoo, everything. And they demanded that the city tear it down and rebuild a new place or just shut it down. So there's a big bond, there's all these politics, I'm sure you can imagine. The city voted actually to replace it, to rebuild a new Laguna Honda. And at that time I took time off to write God's Hotel because it had been an amazing experience. And also to think about what I'd seen so far in my life as a doc. And it seemed to me that during my life as a doc, the pendulum has swung from the personal to the efficient. And I am ever more impressed by how inefficient that efficiency is, right? Because no matter what anybody figures out what to do, hold on, let me go back here. No matter all the stuff that the economists have tried to do to get a hold of our healthcare costs rise every year, right? And nobody quite knows why. There's DRGs and HMOs and you name it. And yet every year, up, 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 up. So I sat down one time with, and decided to figure out what had happened at Laguna Honda while I was there. And I put together this. So while I was at Laguna Honda, in the interest of saving money, the number of patients we took care of was decreased from 1,178 when I first got there to 780 when I left. And doctors correspondingly were decreased from 32 to 9. And correspondingly, to save money, obviously, and correspondingly, the clinical staff was decreased from 1,500 to 1,200. But when I looked at it in detail, I realized, oddly, in spite of all that, although the patients went down, the doctors went down, the clinical staff went down, our budget went up every year. What accounted for that? Well, when I really looked into it, what I found was that the patients go down, the docs go down, the clinical staff goes down, but the total staff stayed about the same. We had the same number total of staff. The difference was that we had more and more administrators every year. Really. And what do all those administrators do, I asked myself. Well, the one thing we had more of at Laguna Honda on the day I left than the day I got there were forms. When I first got there, we had these old paper charts, and there were 2 single-page pages of forms in the chart. The day before I left, as a random example, I pulled out one of our paper charts, and I just counted how many forms there were. There were 43 forms. None of them were single pages. They were 3-page forms, 5-page forms, 20-page forms. There were so many forms that the charts would explode from the forms, and the medical records would have to come and thin out the doctor's notes. And this is the example I made from I put it all together in this to sort of understand it. So here are the patients going down, here are the docs going down, here's the patients going down, there's the docs going down, there's the staff thing about the same, there's the budget, and there's the number of forms. And if you look and you see that if current trends continue at Laguna Honda, I realized that by 2024, there were going to be no patients at Laguna Honda. 2 doctors, a staff of 1,400, a budget of $280 million, and an infinite number of forms. What's scary about this? It's on track. Because I did this several years ago, and periodically I check, and this is actually on track. So I began to think of this as like doing less with more. And the thing is, and so the last part of my talk is sort of is this same thing that's happening at Laguna Honda is happening across the country, and the country as a whole. So here we have the growth of physicians and administrators. You can see that in the last I guess I could look at it here, huh? In the last, it's so odd though. We've doubled. I can't do it that way. Sorry, people. I just have to do it like this. So if you look at the docs, right, in the last 40 years, the docs have doubled in our country, right on parallel with our population. The administrators, 35 times as many administrators. And similarly, if you look at paperwork, and this just goes to 2010, but paperwork in just 10 years doubled. Okay? And correspondingly, our budget has gone up, not surprisingly. So I'm going to end here with telling you about 2 studies, because my hypothesis has been that if we take slow medicine seriously, and we take the efficiency of inefficiency seriously, that I believe that if doctors and nurses have enough time to do a good job, get the right diagnosis and the right treatment, that's how we can save money. So I'm going to end with 2 studies, really interesting studies that were both funded by CMS in 2012. They're both 5-year studies. And they sort of test the two different hypotheses. The first one was called the Comprehensive Primary Care Initiative. And it was a study to test what happens if you have extra money and you do all the new things that are supposed to help patient care so much. So, for instance, this is directly taken. They did have risk stratified care management, planned care for chronic conditions and preventative care, enhanced access and continuity of care via improved patient portals, patient and caregiver engagement, and case continuity via case manager coordination. They got a grant. This is their model. They picked 512 clinics across the country, and they had 512 to compare. They followed costs, patient satisfaction for 5 years, and their conclusion was, results from the Comprehensive Care Initiative illustrate how hard it is to reduce Medicare spending. Now, there's a second fascinating article that, bless CMS's soul, they funded at the same time. And it's by a fascinating economist internist at the University of Chicago named David Meltzer. And his belief is that when doctors have enough time, that's how we save money. He got a grant to do that. And his insight, which I think is crucial and what I really want you to take with you, if nothing else from this, his key insight was that, I'll go over here now, was that 10% of people count for about 63% of our costs. 5% for 43%. That if you take the 5% of the chronically ill, the complex that we all know, and you put your energy into those, that's how you save the money. And so the way I'm doing okay on time, perfect. The way he set up his study was, again, it was a 5-year study. It was at the University of Chicago. And he put together a sort of, I think of it as concierge care for the sick poor, essentially, really. He put together a group of docs, and he randomized patients who had to be admitted through the University of Chicago Hospital. One went to the Group A. Group A got usual care. They got admitted, they saw all these different hospitalists, they spun around, they had things happen to them, they got spit out to wherever, whatever. And Group B saw David's group, who saw a specific doctor in the hospital. When they got discharged to that doctor's clinic. The clinic was really a true lean machine. It had just a nurse. I like to say an old, hard-bitten, old RN person, right? Tough. And eventually he added a social worker. And eventually he added a community healthcare worker. Those 3. And he followed how these 2 groups did. He had 200 in each one. And it was amazing to see the difference. His outcome was in the group that had this kind of specific personal care. There were 15 to 25% fewer hospitalizations, 95% patient satisfaction scores, and that Medicare spending was reduced by $3,000 per year per patient. So it's a pretty impressive example of what happens when doctors and nurses have enough time. And what I think it points out is something really interesting, what I'll end with here. And this is what I call the iceberg of health and sickness. That I was thinking about this one day, and I thought it was better to draw it. So the thing about patients, when we are all here thinking about patients, we kind of just think about patients, right? But actually, they're very different. And if you think about it as an iceberg, 50% of people are healthy. They're fine. There's nothing wrong with them. They should probably see doctors not. Okay? And then, you know, there's 25% of people who become acutely ill and they get better. And then there's 15% who become chronically ill. This is when you start needing slow medicine, in my opinion. And it's this top 10%, maybe even 5%, who only need the kind of this, let's call it slow, this kind of time-intensive care. And the reason this is fundamentally so important for all of us, even if you're not sick yourself, is that over time, we all naturally move down this, not longer, it's not a pyramid anymore, but it's something, an arrow, I guess, of time, where we'll move from being not sick to being acutely sick and then getting better, and then eventually getting chronically ill, and then eventually getting in this last piece. And I think the place for us to go is to really concentrate on this part here. If we can get this right, a lot of good things are going to follow. So I think that is where I will end my talk.
Thank you so much. We do have time. Yeah, the voice
good.
from God.
Yeah,
No, it's
perfect.
Me. We do have time for questions, and I just thought maybe I would ask you the first question, Dr. Sweet.
Where are you? There you are.
Here I am. And that is, building on your last point, I know it's an oversimplified question, but how do we do more of addressing that top 10%?
Right.
How do we do a better job of that here in the region?
Exactly. Thank you so much for that question. So one of the things I was so struck by was what it was like to be in a city where we had this old-fashioned general hospital and this old-fashioned almshouse. It took so much of the stress off docs all over the place. They kind of knew, last resort, they could send the patient to Laguna Honda. And so that's one of the things we're missing. I mean, I think there's many ways to do this, but I think at some level we're missing a safety net of the safety net. I mean, just think what it would be like if we had the old-fashioned county system was pretty cool, actually. And before I got here, a couple of days ago when I was thinking about this, I found a report from 1910 on almshouses in California. there were 534 almshouses in 1910. So almost every city, town had a way of taking care of the sick poor, had a place to send people. So I think that's one of the things we're missing. And related to that, because the same movement that wrecked the almshouses, that took them down, then it turned its attention consciously in the 80s to the state mental institutions, which is the other huge piece that we're missing. We're missing institutions. We're missing some place. And I've often thought how comforting it would be from just a healthcare insurance point of view. If everybody knew, worse comes to worse, they could always go to the county hospital. And it might be funky and it might be whatever, but they could go there and get essentially free care. That's what I would answer to that. So I think that's one thing that I would love to see put back as a way to deal with that piece. There's lots of other things, and I'm sure other people will have some more questions.
So we have other questions from the audience.
Hi, my name's Lindsay, and I'm from MPC, and I don't know if you're familiar with Atule Gwande and the new health insurance company, Haven, that they're starting. So I'm intrigued to know your thoughts about that regarding what you're talking about today, because you remind me a lot of what he talks to us about in his book, Better.
Yes. The great question. I actually, when I heard that he was getting together with Bezos and what's his name? Buffett, I thought, wow, I actually wrote up for myself like a whole little scheme about what I would do. I don't know what they're going to come up with. I have a feeling it would be quite different. I mean, they have a kind of different catchment area, but I think it's pretty brilliant. So because it was Amazon, I actually let myself really I said, okay, it's Amazon. So if I think about my pyramid, and we think that the 50% of people down here, which is mostly who you're going to insure, right? These are the people that are being insured. You got 50% of people who basically are pretty healthy, right? And what do they do now? They go online, right? They search for their symptoms, and that's fine because they're really not sick. So let them search for their symptoms. No, they're not really sick. They're not sick, right? They got a rash. They can find it. Have that really great. Model the system on this. So have it that it expects you to go online, and it has really good information. And my ideal would be that there'd be a little attachment. Okay, I'm going off into sci-fi land here, but it's fun. A little attachment to your computer that could actually stick your finger in it, and it can do your blood and everything. And then Amazon drones you the medication. Because honestly, if I never had to go to a hospital again, I'd be thrilled. So that would work. That would work up to the point it didn't work, right? And then at some point it stops working because you're really sick, right? And that really sick part, that first part, I think is an interesting place to have, to a certain extent, your nurse practitioners and your physician extenders. Because those are acute illnesses, right, that are usually responsive pretty quickly. You kind of jump from here, you jump up into there, you get treated, and you go back down. But once you get up to that next level is when I believe you start needing a doctor, your doctor, who knows you. That we will save a ton of money when your doctor knows you, and we take a lot of the widgets out of it. So this is where I would put my docs, and I would put my really concentrated docs, my best docs, at the very top there. So that's kind of a little bit some of my thoughts about what I would do.
Oh.
Question over here.
Yes, Dr. Sweet, thank you. I'm a nurse by profession, and my question is, when a practitioner, a physician or nurse has the experience and intuition honed over years of practice, how that seems to be less taken into consideration when it comes to treatment and overview of patient care, and how this efficiency, this, malpractice insurance, all of these, barriers really to allowing physicians and nurses to practice with their intuition, and how that seems to be taken away. And I wondered, in this, realm of patient body as machine, if you could speak to it's more or less the squirrel cage that we're feeling, when it comes to treatment.
So on the one hand, what you're talking about is the art of medicine, the art of healing, the art of nursing. And I will say, in defense of any mechanics we have there, a really good mechanic, there's an art of machines too. Because one days I realized, I don't know about your car, but my car, as soon as it has a name, it functions better. There's a kind of overlap. I mean, just because, so I think that part's interesting, but I guess that's neither here nor there. But I did want to put that in. So it's really the art of healing. It's really the craft of healing. Because craft is a word that takes in both art and experience, knowledge, all that stuff as a craft. And this is sort of the, depressing part of this thing is craft is a beautiful thing. And craft is completely antithetical to a capitalist industrial stance that sees everything as a big thing to grind up everything and have profit come out the other side. So I think there's something, the reason you feel like a squirrel cage is you are a squirrel in a squirrel cage, and I think it's dreadful what's going on, and it pisses me off. Hold it.
We have a question here. Mary, sorry.
Hello, I'm Mary, an educator, and I read your book, God's Hotel, and it deeply changed my perspective. And as I was reading it, I desperately wanted to ask you a question, and now here you are. So I really appreciate that. I felt that the message that you were sharing about your experience in the medical practice, I felt that there was a deeper message for all of us, and I just wanted to know if the feeling I had was true.
Yes. So, yes, because that actually fits into the craft thing. It's actually a very moving experience. Towards the end of the time I was at Laguna Honda, it was sort of eerie. I found that I did less and less with my patients, and they got better and better. It was very strange. It's a very, but you can't really talk about it, so I can't talk about it. It's just true. It's just there's this thing that goes on, and when you meet somebody who's a really good doc, a really good nurse, you feel it. You can just feel there's this magical part of it that affects you, yourself, as the person, as a doc, as a nurse. But you can't really talk about it, so I try not to talk about it. Does that answer your question? I mean, I'm going to leave it at that, because it just doesn't, it can't.
Do we have time for another question over here?
We'll go do one here, and then we'll do you, and we'll go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Amy. I just wanted to ask you about the mental component with healing, as far as, you're talking about physicians spending more time with their patients, and it was at least a year ago I heard a podcast talking about a study that was done where there was sort of a placebo effect. When patients spent more time with their physicians, they felt more cared for, and that they actually had higher, they healed faster, they got better faster, they weren't as sick, that has a huge factor in all of that. So I was wondering if you know of any studies that looked into that, or if you're aware of that.
I think I saw that study, actually, but I can't remember it enough to comment on that particular study. There's a couple of different pieces. So one is there's the actual time component, like the minutes, but they're not nearly as important as the kind of time it is. And the study that I like, that really changed a lot of my practice, was a study they did quite a few years ago, probably 25 years ago. But it was really an impressive study, because the slow part of slow medicine is not how many minutes, it's what happens in those minutes. And so the sitting, the talking, the touching is separate from the actual time it takes to do that. So the study, they wanted to sort of know how just that kind of worked. So they did a study in a hospital for the surgical patients. So they would have this surgeon, they divided it, there were 3 groups. And the surgeon was going to spend 5 minutes with his patient, or her patient, but it was his, 5 minutes. In the morning, they'd come by making rounds. And the first group would spend 5 minutes, and they'd stand at the door, the threshold, kind of peek in for 5 minutes. So they had some on a buzzer that the patient couldn't hear, but the doc could hear. So they said, exactly 5 minutes. How you doing, Mrs. Smith? You feeling okay? Okay. The second group came by in the morning to a different group. I think it was a different group of patients, and came in the room and stood by the patient's bed, maybe at the foot of the bed, for 5 minutes. How you doing? And the third group, the doc walked in and sat on the bed for 5 minutes. And in that same afternoon, they had social workers, students come by, and say, well, did you see your doctor today? Oh, yeah, I saw Doctor. How long did he spend with you? And the first group said, oh, he just came flying by. The group where the doc stood at the foot of the bed, oh, he spent about, 10 minutes. The group where the doc sat on the bed said, oh, he was here a long time. We had a nice visit. So that actually changed, like my own personal practice. I always sit down, if I can, on a patient's bed. So that's kind of, if you think about that, it's sort of an oblique answer to your question, because it isn't so much the time, it's the relation, it's touch, and it's not this sort of, the problem is you end up getting medical students who, hi, Mrs. Smith, they know I'm supposed to, right? It's become sort of robotic, but I don't think it's a robotic. I mean, and back to the question of the woman before, is that your personhood yourself as a doc, as a nurse, is on the line. It is engaged. And when it's engaged, things happen. And when it's not engaged, things don't happen. So in a way, the time, the amount of time, the swirl cage, that's all what's in the way. And using a Hildegardian slow medicine, why don't we remove what's in the way of the doctor and the nurse and the patient having enough of this kind of time together? That's all I have to say.
Thank you so much. Oh, you could get a little. Thank you so much, Dr. Sweet. It was, wow, isn't she great? Another round of applause for her.